Well, happy Tuesday, everybody. Pastor Steve here, and I'm delighted you've joined me for today's devotion. We are in Acts chapter 27 in our Bible reading plan. I hope you've already read the chapter and written in your journal what God has said to you and how you're going to respond to what He showed you in His Word as you read this chapter. Chapter 27, as I'm sure you observed, is a very beautiful, very detailed account of the Apostle Paul's journey, voyage by ship from Caesarea, where he had been in prison for 2 years, on his way to Rome. Now, he doesn't get there until chapter 28. In this chapter, he encounters just a horrible storm at sea and ends up, they crash on an island. And we learn in the first verse of chapter 28, it was the island of Malta. Now, what's interesting, before I share with you what God spoke to my heart, is the number of very precise nautical terms, if you will, that are used by Luke in chapter 27. And we know from history that Luke is accurate. He is actually using accurate, precise nautical terms, sailing terms of his era, which is just fascinating and also points to the reliability of Scripture. We also get great detail because Luke was actually with Paul on this voyage at sea. If you'll notice in chapter 27, verse 1, and we mentioned this a few days ago in another passage, when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, the pronoun we. So Luke is with Paul on this journey. You see the same thing in verse 20. All hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. Again, Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, wrote the Gospel of Luke. That's why it's sometimes referred to as Luke Acts, like a 2-volume set, is with Paul. And then lastly, in verse 37, all of us in the ship were 200. So Luke is with Paul writing this. And this storm lasted just a touch over 2 weeks. And you see that in verse 27 as well, on the 14th night. But when the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea. So this is it was a severe storm. They just had to go with the wind. They had to lighten the boat. And so it was a dangerous situation that lasted almost 2 weeks. And when they were being blown across what we know today as the Mediterranean Sea, in ancient times it was often called by the Hebrews and others of that part of the world, the Great Sea, the average depth of the Mediterranean as they were being driven by that storm is just under 5,000 feet, almost a mile. At its deepest point in the Mediterranean, it is 17,280 feet. So think of 3 miles deep. And so they were in a very precarious situation. Now, with that in mind, what spoke to me are verses 23 to 26. So let's look at that real quickly. Paul is talking to those on board the ship. And he says, for this very night, an angel of God, of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood before me. So one of God's angels stood before Paul. Verse 24, saying, and here's what the angel said to Paul, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, the Roman emperor. You must stand before Caesar, the Roman court in the city of Rome. Behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men. This is Paul now talking to the others on the ship. Keep up your courage, men, for I believe God. He says, that it will turn out exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on a certain island. And then in chapter 28, verse 1, that island where they crashed was Malta, which is a small island south of Cyprus. 475 miles from Crete where the storm started. So that storm, think about this, that storm blew them 475 nautical miles from Crete to Malta. Dangerous situation. But God speaks to Paul in the midst of all of that by an angel saying, you're not going to die. Now the ship will be ruined, will be lost, but you're not going to die, and none of the people on here will die, because I have appointed you to speak before Caesar's court, if you will. Now here's the takeaway. God's plan for Paul was to speak to the leaders of the Roman Empire, court officials. Caesar himself, maybe, we don't know that for a fact, but at least high-ranking officials in Rome. And Paul was going to be kept alive by the Lord, kept safe by the Lord until he did that. And I want you to notice that fulfilling God's will, doing what God calls you to do, is not necessarily easy or without risk. I mean, it was not easy. Paul was in prison for 2 years in Caesarea, and then he's in this severe storm on the way to Rome. It was not easy. His life was at risk. Doing God's will sometimes is easy. Doing God's will at other times is tough, risky. There are challenges and dangers. And bear that in mind. Sometimes we think if I'm doing God's will, everything's going to be rosy, everything's going to be easy. No, sometimes yes, it will, but other times no, it's going to be like Paul's journey in that storm. But it's always worth it. You may face hardship and challenges, but it's always worth it. And one more thing, be a witness along the way, because you see, God had chosen Paul to be a witness to the Roman officials in the city of Rome. But I want you to notice all along the way, back in Jerusalem, when he was arrested by the mob, when he was beaten by the mob and then rescued by the Romans, he stopped and shared the gospel with the crowd that had just beaten him. When he was in Caesarea, every time he was before the governor, whether it was Felix or Festus or Agrippa and others in the court there, sharing the gospel. On this boat during the storm, he shares the gospel. Tomorrow in chapter 28, while on the island of Malta for 3 months, he shares the gospel. When he gets to Rome, where he's in prison for 2 years, he shares the gospel. Here's the point. Paul was on his way to Rome to be a witness for Jesus before the Roman court, the Roman officials. But he did not become so focused on his ultimate destiny that he did not serve God along the way. We have had a lot of focus in recent years on our ones, praying for your one or your multiple ones. There's a risk. It's not intentional, but some of us fall prey to it. Is that we become so focused on praying for our one, my lost grandchild, my lost son or daughter, my lost parent, my lost friend. So focused on that one, it's like we put blinders on. And we don't see other opportunities along the way to share the gospel. Opportunities along the way to invite people to church. And if you are so focused on your one that you don't see other opportunities today, take the blinders off. Keep praying for your one, serving your one, but pray, God, show me today who I can talk to. Show me today who I can invite. Open my eyes, God, and my heart and my mind to see what is in front of me now, not being so focused on my one or on the future that I don't do what I can right now, today, to share the gospel with others. Paul was on his way to Rome, but he talked to everybody about Jesus along the way, and you and I need to do the same thing. I hope you'll do that today and tomorrow, and that you'll have somebody with you Sunday morning in worship at First Baptist Church because you talked to them this week along the way. Hey, God bless you. Tomorrow, chapter 28, as we wrap up the book of Acts.